Dear guests, on behalf of the Institute of History at the University of Iceland, it is with great pleasure that I first of all introduce to you Professor Gro Hagemann. Every year, the Institute of History invites a distinguished foreign historian to come to the University of Iceland and give the Jón Sigurðsson Memorial Lecture. And since this year we are celebrating women's suffrage, it is highly appropriate, to say the least, to have with us here today Gro Hagemann, Professor of Modern History at the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on gender, class, and politics in the 19th and 20th centuries, and she has published books on the history of Norwegian teachers, gender during the process of industrialization, as well as gender in historical research. She is, and this is no exaggeration, I'm not just being polite, she is one of the most influential gender historians in the Nordic countries and also very influential in Europe. And in Iceland, she has had a huge impact, more probably than she is aware of, on gender and women's history. In 1975, during the UN International Women's Year, Gro Hagemann came to Iceland to introduce the field of women's history to the Icelandic academic community. And ever since, women's and gender historians have taken cue in and been inspired by Gro Hagemann's work. So welcome, Gro Hagemann, with your talk, Autonomy and Citizenship, Perspectives on Universal Suffrage in the Nordic Countries. Gro shall be speaking for 35 to 40 minutes, and after that we shall have the panel discussion. Gro, welcome.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I have to start to say congratulations to all Icelandic women and to all of you for this wonderful conference. Dear everyone, gott folk, as we used to say in Norwegian. In 1884, the current Norwegian government was impeached and convicted, and replaced by a liberal government, ushering the era of parliamentary democracy in the country. The very same year, the educated public was also upset by an article published in Nytt Tidsskrift, a new periodical with contributions from several of the leading intellectuals of the time. The article were entitled Some Words About Feminism, Its Progress, and Immediate Tasks in Our Country. And it was nearly a complete feminist program, formulated in a language fully at par with contemporary political rhetoric. It was addressed to women as well as liberal-minded men of the culture and political elite. And it proved effective. A few months later, the major newspapers published an invitation to join the Norwegian Feminist Association, signed by 220 men and women. The writer of the triggering article was Gina Krog, who would become one of the leading figures in the first wave feminism of Norway. She was 37 years of age at the time, unmarried, and a former teacher. In 1880, she gave up her job to keep house for her brother and to devote herself to the cause, as her companions told her later. The very first she took on as a free woman was traveling to Britain to study the struggle for women's suffrage there. She contacted National Union of Suffrage Societies and became acquainted with the organization's leader, Millicent Garrett Fawcett. From Britain, she started to write articles in Norwegian newspaper published anonymously. About the same time, similar initiatives were taken all over the Nordic countries. Early feminist associations were founded in Denmark in 1971, Sweden and Finland also in 1884, and Iceland in 1894. In all countries, there were pioneers like Gina Krog, Mathilde Bayer, Denmark, Sofie Adelsparre, Sweden, Alexandra Gripenberg, Finland, and Brigitte Bjarnhedinsdottir in Iceland. I've chosen the Norwegian pioneer and her article as my starting point, not because she stands out compared to the others, but simply because I know her much better. My purpose today, though, is not to discuss the Norwegian case as such. I have started with this article because I find it suited to illustrate some more general points in the discussion of modern citizenship and women's suffrage campaign. And I picked one peculiar statement from her article, which I will talk about. The point here should be apparent, I think, namely the twofold purpose of feminist action. Gina Krog stresses the significance of struggling to achieve certain political goals, such as suffrage, and equally important, the implications of the very involvement for accomplishing personal autonomy. Nothing brings more freedom and independence than the struggle for freedom and independence. I would assume that similar ideas about freedom and independence were formulated in all the Nordic countries as well. Certainly, there were special situations and events that were triggering the situation or the women's suffrage movements in each country. Still, they were influenced by the same culture currents in 19th century Europe and literary precursors in the Nordic countries. They knew about British and American suffragists and found support and inspiration by contemporary Nordic literature and literature critics. My discussion today will be dealing with the interplay between formal rights, especially suffrage and majority, on one hand, and the courage and ability to speak up and argue for your case on the other. The multiple meanings of the Scandinavian concept of myndighet is central and useful in this setting. It's impossible to translate in a way, but it has different meanings. It includes economic and legal majority, coming to age, as well as personal autonomy and integrity, and finally, authority and capability to speak up in order to influence on decisions made on behalf of the community. In current language, we might have spoken of participation and acting in the civil society. Nordic countries were among the earliest to introduce female suffrage in all the world. In all countries except Sweden, women had been participating in national elections before the end of the World War I. In two countries, Norway as of 1907 and Iceland as of 1915, women gained the right to vote on a basis narrower than men, with tax capability as the criteria in Norway and higher voting age for women in Iceland. During the founding years of modern constitutionalism, voting rights were ruled by expediency of the needs of society and the states. While the boundaries of men's suffrage had to be based in reasonable arguments in accordance with constitutional principles, the exclusion of women from these rights for a long time stood outside the formulated principles, so obvious, so rooted in tradition and convention that no further justification was needed. Throughout the 19th century, it was given that voting was linked to economic independence, responsibility, and ability to contribute economically to community and state. Whatever it was clearly expressed or not, enfranchisement in practice was regarded a privilege of the household master in the early liberal constitutions, like the Norwegian in 1814 and the Danish in 1849. In Norway, at least, a farmer even lost his vote when he retired and passed the farm to his son. Nevertheless, the question was mooted at an early time whether or not female masters of household should be enfranchised as well. In Norway, the issue was raised by a Danish count under the making of the 1814 constitution. The realities of this remark were never discussed further, except for a rather indirect reaction given 2 years later. One member of the parliament, the new parliament, made the proposition to specify that in the law explicitly that voting citizens exclusively were men. Evidently, he saw the need of giving a firm confirmation that any thought of women's suffrage was contrary to the constitutional spirit. The parliamentary committee found the proposal both unnecessary and inappropriate, since the female sex, as they called it, never put forward a requirement for participation in state matters. If not a formal condition, it was nevertheless anticipated as early as this that women who might be enfranchised should have to make the claim themselves. This unstated condition was constantly heard when times were changing after 1870, and Norway, like the other Nordic countries, entered the period I would call of democratic breakthrough. Attitudes were changing as actions were stronger outside the parliament, for universal suffrage at first, and eventually for women's suffrage. The traditional mindset gradually was replaced by another kind of justification for voting rules, even within the parliament. What previously had been defined a matter of expedience, of serving the community and the state, were now reconfigured to a matter of justice. Equality before the law. Voting rules were redefined from a selective right by substance to a universal right by person. The tradition may be observed, though the transition may be observed in the political debates in all Nordic countries, I suppose. Here I will give some expressive examples on how this process took place in Norway. In 1886, the Norwegian Parliament, for the first time ever, was to process a proposal for universal suffrage, including, one of the proposals, both men and women. The proposal was not adopted, of course, and suffrage for women were not even debated. Still, there were new notes to be heard in this debate, and several who believed that, as it was said, the trend is moving toward universal suffrage, sooner or later. Concern for the state and the needs of society appears no longer as equally indispensable. In the first petition sent to the Parliament, the suffrage women argued that exclusion of women was an injustice in the current legislation. More than 4,000 women signed this petition, which led to the first parliamentary debate on women's suffrage in 1890. Thereafter, these claims were raised for each new parliament until universal suffrage for women was adopted in 1913. In this first debate, the principal standpoints from both sides were more clearly pronounced than ever. What previously had been implicit was formulated in plain speaking. The most outspoken antagonists were conservatives of the old regime in Norway, who put considerable energy and eloquence in their contributions. They definitely held on to the previous principles of suffrage as a matter of expediency. I have a problem with that word. Suffrage must have the needs of society in sight. From members of parliament like this, suffrage was really regarded as a threat against society's durability and welfare. No less than horror pictures were drawn up by another conservative member of the parliament in the same debate, who virtually imagined a complete breakdown of society and its basic institutions. Disturbance of homes, successful dissolution of family life, and hence unavoidable following the fall of social morality. Opinions of this kind attracted a great attention in the public newspapers. They were following the debate closely, and cartoonists got many good topics for the social satire. However, these kinds of arguments were already in the process of being marginalized. During the following debates on women's suffrage, such arguments were barely promoted. You find them, but they did not dominate at all. The whole mindset from the old regime were about to be yesterday's thoughts, which were pushed back in favor of more modern ideas like this. Not less that her human dignity made the reason for women's equal status, according to this member. Her enfranchisement is a simple matter of fairness, a right by person. This very member who expressed this clear principle belonged to the parliament's radical left at the time, a group of members who advocated immediate decision of universal suffrage for both men and women. For the majority in the left party, however, suffrage for women was still a matter of conditional justice. Moving forward step by beginning with the independent women, who primarily had raised requirement in her own name. This argument stood even firmer after the men got universal suffrage in 1898. In fact, it was a rather stronger argumentation than the opposite. When the former justification for suffrage had fallen and practically all men now were allowed to vote, why should not women be included in this? The argument, not least from the left, was that the majority of women were lacking knowledge and lacking also interest in politics. A comparison of men's suffrage movement and women's movement fell out definitely in the favor of men. The majority of women were politically disinterested, claimed the delegates, and therefore they did not deserve to vote. Such arguments had some support also among women. Among the majority of suffrage women, however, this standpoint triggered rage and frustration. Eventually, the new situation caused a crisis and rupture in the women's suffrage movement. One fraction of the movement took a more cautious attitude from political views or from tactical considerations. And some of them saw the parliamentary resolution, they were angry about it on their own behalf. Hundreds of independent women formulated their objection in petitions to the parliament in 1901. Then municipal voting was to be adopted for all men, once again, without including female voting whatsoever. This protest from tax-paying women in Ålesund is only one of the protests coming into the parliament at the time. The other fraction of suffragists chose another strategy. They now fully realized the importance of mobilizing more energetically women outside the ranks of educated middle-class women. And they managed, indeed, not least by exploiting the situation created by the union conflict with Sweden, when all Norwegian men were called to the polls in 1905 to determine the union's future. Since women were not allowed to participate, not even in this vote, they organized a private referendum. Almost 300,000 women from all over the country, urban and rural, personally gave their signature in support to dissolving the union. The first step into political citizenship followed shortly after in 1907, when nearly half of the women over age of 25 got the suffrage, following their own or their husband's tax capability. No matter what position they took, however, it's undoubtedly that quite many women at this time had the courage and the capability that Gina Krog called for in 1884. They even had the strength of exposing publicly disagreements among themselves. The struggle for freedom and independence had definitely contributed to a new freedom and independence. From the argument given by the members of parliament, these capabilities seem to have been quite important for them as well. In fact, more important than women's legal status, which was only partially admitted married women at this time. Or admitted, yeah. It's true that civil rights for women in many countries all over, also outside the Nordic countries, originated from achieving their political rights rather than following the male course of citizenship described by T.H. Marshall in his seminal essay, Citizenship and Social Class. Thus, civil rights for women in many countries originated from achieving their political rights rather than following the male course of citizen development. Marshall himself was the first one to point at this incongruity in his theory. In his chronological tripartite of civil, political, and social citizenship, he regarded civil citizenship, the first and fundamental, to be appurtenant by all adult members of society during the 18th century, or rather, he adds, to all male members, since the status of women, or at least married women, it was in some important respects peculiar. Some historians argue that the Nordic region makes an exception from this rule. Only in the Nordic countries, they have said, women's citizenship followed the same trend as men's, with civil rights before political. Other historians would argue against this underlining of a Nordic exceptionalism in the 19th century interplay between civil and political rights. It's at least a truth with modifications. Within 1870, majority and economic liberty were admitted to unmarried women and widows all over the Nordic region. These were privileges ruled by a family principle, though, given in the absence of a male breadwinner, and it was lost by marriage. Liberal marriage law, with full majority and influence for married women, were not adopted in all Nordic countries until the 1920s, and not fully even then, and everywhere women were already enfranchised or about to be. If still more or less legally minors, however, Nordic women were far from being silent and paralyzed in real life. We have already met Gina Krog and her generation of well-informed middle-class women who regarded feminism as far more than just legal equality. It was just as much a question of becoming autonomous human beings who were taking part in the civil society and the public debates. Similar authority in real life was held by women, especially married women, in the rural communities as well, with a dominance of small, self-owned family farms in large parts of the Nordic region. The guardianship of wives and the traditional power of the master certainly formed an obstacle for the economic equality in marriage relations. In its Nordic version, however, it may equally well have created opportunities for a de facto freedom for married women to take action long before the law made her of full age. Marriage and household patterns with late marriages based on secure livelihoods and relatively even ages spouses made a good condition for a balanced interaction between the spouses and a relatively independent position for the wives. Before this was discussed in the terms of liberal law, they often contributed economically to the family economy and were also participating in popular movements emerging in the countryside over the 19th century. Philanthropic and religious associations, mission and temperance movements were building its success on the commitment and activity of women. Thus, the active attitude being requested from parliamentarians during the suffrage debate was present among women, regardless of their legal status. Whether they belonged to a new generation of educated and self-employed middle-class women, or they were rural women with no other formal education than primary school and perhaps a course in home economics from an agriculture college, they were capable of having opinions about society and able to act on it. Their education, together with economic activity and participation in the civil society, instigated autonomy and authority rooted in other institutions than the law. This kind of myndighet is illustrated here by the Assembly of Nordic Delegates at the Nordic Feminist Meeting in Oslo, Christiania at the time, in 1902. After having included the vast majority of both men and women as political citizens, this form of autonomy lost its relevance as voting condition. Passivity and lack of representation was silently accepted as long as the female electorate behaved relative to the playing rules and conformed to the existing parties. It would take 60 years and new actions by women before this changed. There were other reasons to withdraw voting rights which did not disappear, though. Among them was the exemption of poor people, those who failed to make their living without public support. This poor law mentality, the linking of social deprivation to political rights, was introduced along with generous or universal suffrage. This is an aspect of enfranchisement not much research on. Neither is the continuance of this poor law mentality. It hasn't been easy to find. As far as I know, Norway was the first country to do away with this provision. It did not take long before after 1913 before this suspension was removed. First, for unemployed and ill people. 2 years later, in 1916, and 2 years later, even for those who needed help for their economic survival, just because they were poor. It goes without saying, I suppose, that women were the majority of the last category. It is precisely this poor law mentality T.H. Marshall had in mind when introducing a third element in modern citizenship. In addition to civil and political, he sees the necessity of a third element, social citizenship. A full-fledged democracy, he argued, had to include a social element to ensure that unemployed, poor people, and other marginalized groups were incorporated. To avoid political breakdowns similar to the ones seen in Europe, in some European countries before the war, which caused the war, democracy had to be in the interest of all citizens. For the clear reason to make all citizens politically capable, he introduced the concept of social citizenship at first in a lecture at the University of Oxford in 1949. Social citizenship in Marshall's definition is about the reinforcement of the Western democracy by making each adult man and woman fully capable citizens. And this is not only a matter of welfare politics, it's also about personal capability. His reasoning, actually, is similar to the previous stance of activity and competence being a requirement for voting. There is an important difference, however. While this, in the times of Gina Krog and the early suffrage debates, was a matter of resources and suitability of the very individual, it was for Marshall a social obligation to ensure that everyone got access to the resources and knowledge necessary to exercise full citizenship. This twofold purpose of Marshall's plan is often forgotten in current discourse about social citizenship. That was not the case in the decades immediately after the war, however. Maintaining and strengthening of democracy was given priorities in purpose of schools, broadcasting, and culture policy all over the West, and not least in the Nordic countries. National radio stations, dominant and publicly controlled, were given a key role in the spread of the public education and information. Theater, music, opera were made available to a much larger degree for ordinary public by means of public subsidies. In Norway, there were also a lot of touring institutions. They were established to bring culture out to all parts of the country in the spread habitated country. Everything was done from the purpose of securing the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society. I have come to my conclusion. I think I have one more. The period of struggle for female suffrage in the Nordic countries makes a proud history. But it's also, naturally, a history that we may learn something from. The commitment and the efforts that characterize this history and the seriousness of suffrage women in their fight for fundamental democratic rights have not always been kept alive through the generations after the vote was won. Although voting is and should be a right by person, it is also a right that requires concerning capability and participation from the citizens. It seems unnecessary to remind about this in this audience here, but it's necessary to remember that not everyone is taking part the way we would want them to, and that there are scaring tendencies going on around in Europe and the Nordic countries today, which might be a threat to democracy. Also, Marshall's concept of social citizenship is important to have in mind. His thinking should remind all of us that democracy and democratic attitudes by no means are natural conditions. The struggle for freedom and independence was in its time invaluable to achieve freedom and independence. What we have achieved, though, will constantly have to be maintained and recreated by struggling again and again for freedom and independence. Thank you.